begin by making some introductory remarks about the Holy Spirit, whom the Catholic Encyclopedia defines as the third consubstantial person of the Holy Trinity. Now, I want to make the point that the Holy Spirit is actually a person, and he has all the characteristics of personhood, because this is often overlooked by virtue of his being a quote-unquote spirit. The Holy Spirit thinks, speaks, leads, and can even be grieved. He's sometimes described as the Spirit of Christ, but he's not an apparition or a floating bedsheet or something like that. He's not a poltergeist. So right away, our language puts us into a problem of referring to him as the Holy Spirit, because spirit feels like an inadequate term. Anyway, let's look at this definition again. The Holy Spirit is the third consubstantial person of the Holy Trinity. Now, consubstantial is a loaded term. It means with substance. So like we've discussed, God is one substance in three persons. So the Holy Spirit is God. He's not equal with God. He's fully God himself. And if we consider the Holy Spirit to be a form of God, then we assent to the heresy of Sabellianism, where we think of the Holy Spirit as merely one aspect of God, like God's arm or something. And if we consider the Holy Spirit a manifestation of God, then we assent to a different heresy, the heresy of modalism, where we think that sometimes God shows up looking like the Holy Spirit, and sometimes God shows up looking like Jesus, and sometimes God shows up looking like the Father, like there's three different costumes or something that God wears. But this, of course, is not correct. So C.S. Lewis helps us, though, kind of come to terms with all this, and he says, don't be surprised or worried if you find the Holy Spirit rather vague or more shadowy in your imagination than the other two being, God the Son and God the Father. And I think there's a reason this has to be so, Lewis continues. He says, in the Christian life, you're not usually looking at the Holy Spirit like maybe the apostles could have looked at Jesus, or maybe Moses experienced God on Mount Sinai. But the Holy Spirit is always acting through you. So if you think of the Father as someone out there in front of you, and the Son is someone standing beside you, helping you to pray, trying to turn you into another son, into his image, then you have to think of the third person as something inside you, or maybe behind you. And when we previously talked about the Trinity, we talked about the fact that it's God who prompts us to pray. It's God to whom we're praying, and it's God who prays through us. So this language leaves us with a ridiculous set of supernatural prepositions, which is why we've come to identify God as simply being omnipresent. He's everywhere. He's in, on, out, through, beyond, etc. So if we want to try and get more specific, we can think of the Holy Spirit in and through us. Another big question for us to ask would be, what is the Holy Spirit like? Now, the original indication is in John 14, where we read about the Paraclete, or Parakletos. It's a difficult word to translate, but that's the word that we commonly use for the Holy Spirit. And sometimes it's rendered comforter, as in somebody who comes alongside of us, somebody who comes alongside someone else. Sometimes it's rendered encourager or counselor. And Jesus told his disciples that the Father would send them another Parakletos, another counselor, for example. So after Jesus left the earth, he sent the Holy Spirit to do for all Christians what the earthly Jesus did personally for only those few who knew him directly. So the word another, of course, means of the same kind. So in a sense, then, the Holy Spirit is just like Jesus because of his with-usness, without being just like Jesus in terms of his function or personality. And the frustration that we have with Trinitarian doctrine, the thing that troubles A, people of other religions, and B, people of no religion, or even C, critics of Christianity, it tends to be one of two things. Either the deity of Jesus or the deity and the equality of the Holy Spirit. And one of the big arguments people raise is that the Holy Spirit doesn't show up until the book of Acts, almost at the end of the Bible. So how can the Holy Spirit be God if he only showed up, 6/10 of the way through the Bible? Where was the Holy Spirit throughout the Old Testament, for example? Where was the Holy Spirit before the day of Pentecost? Well, let's take a few minutes to respond to some of those arguments. And first, it should be noted that we do actually see evidence of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament, specifically during the creation account in Genesis 1. So we're told that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The Spirit of God, that's the Holy Spirit, caused new things to come into being and brought order out of chaos. And so we see that same Holy Spirit working in the same kinds of ways in our lives today. He brings order out of the chaos of our lives. He brings order to our emotions, order to our relationships, order to our finances, order to our understanding, order to our brokenness. And so he moves us out of brokenness, out of hurt, out of our woundedness. So amazingly, out of this giant mess comes some semblance of order by the grace of God's Spirit. And we see the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament coming on particular people at specific times for unique tasks. So these are some of my favorite Bible stories, like Bezalel, the artist, in Exodus 31. This, of course, is what every musician or artist hopes happens. They hope that God supernaturally empowers them to be amazing, because that's what the Spirit did with Bezalel. He filled Bezalel with skill and ability and knowledge to make all kinds of crafts and artistic designs for work in gold and silver and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of craftsmanship. So, today, when you think about amazing works of art like St. Peter's Basilica or the Sistine Chapel, you get the sensation that there's like this otherworldly quality to that art that's rightly attributed to God's Holy Spirit. Anyway, back in the Old Testament, another great example would be Gideon. Gideon was the least among all the people in his tribe, and he was almost an antagonist to God, but then he was empowered supernaturally by the Holy Spirit to become a mighty leader and a judge. Likewise, in the story of Samson, we see really a baffling tale about somebody who's consecrated by his parents to God, and he takes a vow to never cut his hair, become a Nazirite, and the Spirit comes on Samson to give him supernatural strength. Which then, of course, he uses to beat up bad guys with the jawbone of a donkey and defend his homeland. This is a weird story, but a fun story. There's also Isaiah, the prophet. The Holy Spirit comes upon Isaiah to preach and to prophesy, to bring good news to the poor and to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, to release prisoners from darkness, and to comfort all those who mourn. But the point is that we see the Spirit all throughout the Scriptures. And in the Old Testament, we see him in creation, and then we see him coming upon particular people at particular times for particular tasks. And now that Spirit that was sort of doled out in bits and pieces is poured out lavishly on all those who love and follow Jesus Christ.